US and Israel are asserting aerial dominance over Iran. However, despite 3 weeks of relentless bombardment, Iran retains a commanding position in the Strait of Hormuz, a critical choke point for global oil trade. And now my colleague Shreya Upadhyay will explain you how Iran's dominance over the critical choke point of Hormuz is there. Listen in.
The Strait of Hormuz, as we all know, is a critical choke point for global oil trade, and that is why it is a critical artery of global oil trade as well. Remember, this is an extremely important strait that we have been talking about in the last few days. It connects major oil producers to mega oil importers across the world, and that is why it is the global oil artery. Remember, 25% of the seaborne oil flows through this very strait. It usually passes through this strait. 138 vessels carry out the voyage through the Hormuz every day under normal circumstances. But remember, this number has come down to 5 or 6, just 5 or 6 vessels per day. Before the war began, 20 million barrels of oil used to pass. This is right here. Before the war happened, remember, 20 million barrels of oil was crossing the strait on a daily basis. But now that number has come down to just 3.5 million barrels of oil that is passing through this waterway under the shadow of the war. There's also ambiguity over the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Remember, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has said that this transit is open. The transit route is open, but insurance companies are hesitant to cover this war damages. Araghchi has also urged America to try and respect and not, threaten the other allies. He's also added that freedom of navigation cannot be, existing without the freedom of trade. Respect both or expect neither. So Iranian leadership has been extremely clear as far as the Strait of Hormuz is concerned. Now, the U.S. President Donald Trump has extended his previous ultimatum to Iran. Remember, Trump had earlier said, I have instructed the Department of War to postpone any and all military strikes. This is just a few hours back when he said that no strikes on the energy and power plants will happen on Iran. But he said that if Hormuz remains closed beyond 48 hours, those strikes will happen. Now, the U.S. president says that there will be no strikes, as we have been talking about, on Iran's energy and power plants for the next 5 days, 5 working days at that. This, remember, comes as diplomacy takes its course to bring a complete end of war in West Asia. Whether or not it happens, we'll have to wait and watch. The Strait of Hormuz, meanwhile, remember, is a sea route that fuels Asian economies as well, and that is why a lot of concerns here in India as well. Asian countries receive about 80% of their oil from the Strait of Hormuz that passes through the strait. And in all of these Asian countries, remember, China tops the list at 27%, followed by India, which receives about 10.5% of its oil. And South Korea and Japan receive around 8.5% as well as 8% of their total oil through this very strait, the Strait of Hormuz. It is Asia's energy lifeline. It is significant because a large amount of total oil imports of the Asian countries passes through this very narrow passage. Let's also take a look at India, the situation in India. Remember, India receives 90% of its entire LNG imports and 30% of its crude oil imports via the Strait of Hormuz. China also depends on Hormuz for its oil and LNG needs. Beijing imports 28.4% of LNG from the Strait of Hormuz. It also receives 40% of its crude oil imports through this very strait. Extremely important. Let's also talk about South Korea, where 70% of the crude imports come from the Strait of Hormuz, while 20% of the LNG comes from this strait. One of the closest American allies in the region, Japan, let's talk about that. Japan also relies heavily on the Strait of Hormuz for its energy needs. 95%, that's a large amount of oil that comes through the Strait of Hormuz for Japan. 95% of the crude imports comes from there, while 6% of Japan's LNG imports are received via the Strait of Hormuz. Now, Iran says that vessels of all countries except one belong to the US and its allies are allowed to pass through this very strait, the Strait of Hormuz. But the vessels, remember, have been hesitant to carry out this voyage. 20 ships have been attacked so far in and around this very strait. This entire strait that you see, the vessels going from there, in the last few weeks since the war began, at least 20 vessels have been attacked. Now, America has been mulling naval escorts, but there has been no confirmation yet. There's been a lot of speculation about that as well. In fact, the US president has talked about it himself, but no confirmation as such as far as, the vessel movement is concerned from here. Insurance companies are charging hefty war risk premiums because there is a risk as far as the vessels are, passing from there. The costs of insurance premiums have been going up, and now they have gone up to 25 times higher. That is a lot of cost that is now coming on to just making vessels pass through the Strait of Hormuz.